Let's get some insights from SeaLight Director and retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Ray Powell. He joins us this morning on Morning Matters. So welcome to the show.
Hi, Gretchen. Good to see you again.
Good to see you. Let's begin first before we talk about the Code of Conduct. I wanted to know what SeaLight is seeing out in the West Philippine Sea as the Atin Ito coalition makes its way to Pagasa. I remember in the first mission, you alerted a possible blockade by Chinese ships. How about this time?
Well, I see a good gathering of Chinese ships near Pagasa, including at least one Chinese Coast Guard and several maritime militia. I'm guessing there are more that are not visible on the automatic information system. The ship that Rafael David was talking about shadowing them, I'm guessing that was 21549, which was hanging out near El Nido. It has also been dark, so I haven't been able to see it recently, but I'm assuming it's the same ship.
It's probably is it relatively peaceful? Is it safe to say that? I mean, compared to the past encounters with a Chinese Navy ship not in sight and just two CCG vessels?
Honestly, China may be starting to learn some lessons about how not to do these things. I mean, their blockade, as I called it in last year, when the fishing vessels went out to Scarborough Shoal, Bahadim Masanok, was a little over the top. And yes, I did refer to it as a blockade, and I was roundly criticized by Chinese state media for that. But I call them like I see them. But I don't see anything quite like that yet this time, and maybe they're learning.
It's a hopefully peaceful voyage ahead. Let's go to the Code of Conduct that President Marcos has called for in the ASEAN summit. He said that he wants a legally binding Code of Conduct. The call for it being legally binding, would that be the main difference from the 2002 Declaration of Conduct?
Yeah, that really is the sticking point, right? So the problem with the DOC, as we call it, the 2002 DOC, is that China has systematically violated most of it, and there is nobody to, there's no sheriff to go put the perpetrator in jail. So, and the problem going forward is, who would that sheriff be? Would it be some kind of committee, or agreed upon? But China's not going to agree to that. They just have too much invested in their current status as being, frankly, the sole arbiter of what's right and wrong across the entire South China Sea.
I remember listening to you on StoryCon with Reg and Ed, and you said that somehow China has not violated some provisions in the DOC. What was that again?
So, I mean, okay, so for example, China routinely denies freedom of navigation to the Philippines. Even that last Atin Ito mission, most of the vessels had to stop 50 nautical miles or more short of Scarborough Shoal. There's no reason to do that except for the denial of freedom of navigation. Even if we were to yield China's point that they believe they own Scarborough Shoal, that would still only gain a 12 nautical mile territorial sea, but they are enforcing it out 50 nautical miles. So that is legally, that is illegal under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and under the DOC. DOC, one of their declarations is that the parties reaffirm their respect for and commitment to the freedom of navigation, blah, 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 all the way through, and specifically invokes the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and they violate that. They violate the one that says that they will, that the parties will exercise self-restraint. Well, I'm sorry, but ramming and water cannoning are not self-restraint. So these are the things they routinely violated, and then they nitpick little things that the Philippines does, and will say those are the violations. For example, trying to bring construction materials to the BRP Sierra Madre at Ayungin Shoal. They'll say, well, that's a violation because they say it is, right?
Correct. And I remember now what you mentioned. They haven't been able, or they have not built permanent structures on uninhabited islands. Is that something that they continuously adhere to? And why do you think that's a strategy of China? Why haven't they violated that specific provision?
Well, I think what they're hoping is that by sort of not doing that, that they will be able to sort of keep some semblance of moral high ground for that specific thing. So, so that will keep Vietnam and Malaysia and the Philippines from making additional structures on currently uninhabited features. But what they do allow themselves to do under the DOC is to take very, very minimal habitations and turn them into massive military ports and airfields on, these artificial islands that they created. So they basically took the loopholes that they saw in the DOC and drove a very, very large ship through them.
And they do invoke the DOC at times when it is convenient. In particular, in a position paper on the South China Sea arbitration, China argued that the DOC is a legally binding agreement, and it said that the Philippines is violating it and is barred from seeking legal recourse through arbitration because it is bound by paragraph 4 to settle disputes only through friendly consultations and negotiations. I mean, did the Philippines somehow also violate paragraph 4?
I would say, certainly, but, it also says, if you continue the sentence all the way to the end, in accordance with universally recognized principles of international law, including the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which allows for arbitration. So, I would say no, the Philippines did not. Obviously, the China, as they tends to take sort of selectively read these things and say, well, this part in particular applies to the Philippines, while all of these other things that are happening do not apply to China.
Well, of course, as we go back to the first point, the legally binding part being the sticking point of this call by the president. I guess several questions are at the heart of that. In particular, who will be the legal authority for that? And isn't that the same as the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea? If that is already a legally binding agreement between states and nations to be able to respect maritime rights, wouldn't a code of conduct somehow be the same?
Well, so in the perfect world, a code of conduct would have and again, an enforcer, a binder, if you will, who would very much stick to the terms of international law as established under the UNCLOS and others. That's why I remain a code of conduct pessimist. I actually believe there will never be a code of conduct because, frankly, anything that China would sign would almost certainly be a very bad deal for the other claimant countries, including the Philippines, because what China would then do is say, this new code of conduct we have supersedes the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea because the relevant parties have agreed to this, and so we can set aside all of those UNCLOS arbitration kinds of things that they do. So that's, again, I think that China will continue to drag out these negotiations. They'll refer all disputes to the Code of Conduct negotiations with the intent of never actually resolving them.
Is that the reason why you mentioned that a code of conduct is not possible if it is done in bad faith? And does that also explain the change in tone of China on this code of conduct? They have expressed interest in achieving that because somehow they have already asserted or they have de facto control over several maritime features. For example, like Scarborough Shoal or over in Sandy Cay.
Well, right. So, and this goes back to your point about them sort of wagging their finger at the Philippines for going to arbitration. What China uses the Code of Conduct negotiations for is another stick to bludgeon the other countries with. So by going to arbitration, the Philippines is saying, look, China is already operating in bad faith. They're already denying us freedom of navigation. They're already being escalatory. They're already, using these tactics, which are clearly coercive, use of force, all of these things, and yet they want to sort of control the discussion of how, the future code of conduct goes. Where the Philippines, frankly, the Philippines' best option is to go to international law, and as they have in the past, and as they may again in the future, because they don't want to submit to a Chinese-dominated body that they perceive as, as a potential outcome on a code of conduct.
But the UNCLOS cannot decide on territorial issues. So what is the best way forward here for the Philippines?
Yeah, so that would have to go to different bodies, right? So other international bodies. So some that have been suggested. In fact, my colleague in Washington D.C., Greg Polling, has suggested that the UN General Assembly would almost certainly vote with the Philippines on if issues were brought to them. Now, in terms of resolving things like who owns Scarborough Shoal, that may be a harder lift than most, because there's such a long contest over it. Now it may be possible, and I don't see China winning that fight, but I'm not sure I see the Philippines winning it either. It may be one of those things that just kind of ends up in a hung jury.
How do you imagine, I know you're a code of conduct pessimist, but how do you imagine an ideal COC amongst ASEAN countries to go, given the characteristics of the region? Comparing it to the EU, for example, they are highly legalistic in terms of their structure, but when it comes to ASEAN agreements and treaties, they are at many times informal and ambiguous when it comes to its being legally binding. How do you imagine an effective COC to be?
Honestly, under the current political environment, I don't imagine an effective COC, even if it was just among ASEAN states, because many of the ASEAN states, I think, would be very heavily pressured by Beijing not to sign up to anything that the claimant states would be interested in. So, the land, say that the Laoses and Cambodias of the world who don't have a direct stake in the South China Sea fight would be leaned on by Beijing to sort of back away and not sign up to things that would annoy Beijing. So I think you're probably, I honestly just don't see a future. I think that you'd have to go more minilateral, and frankly, you'd have to continue to invite in outside parties, which is exactly what China wants to stop. They want to have the EU and the United States and others just to stay out.
Help us to understand why it is more difficult for us to get support in this side of the world as compared to outside. Is it because of
a lot of it just has to do
Yeah.
with the fact that China is so much larger than the countries that immediately surround it. And so it is able to put immense amounts of pressure on those countries. And so, they're just making business decisions, as we would say, right? They have extremely robust trade and economic relationships with China, and they don't see it as being in their national interest to support the Philippines.
Away from the ASEAN-China agreement, is it possible for us to get alliances with countries that have also been intimidated and threatened by China, like Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia? Do you see that as a viable option?
I think that it's going to be issue by issue, and now it may be down the road. See, part of the problem we've seen from especially the countries along that southern tier, Indonesia, Brunei, and Malaysia, they have just kind of hoped that that these kinds of things would pass them by. So they see the Philippines and Vietnam having a lot more trouble than they are. And of course, the Philippines and Vietnam are a lot closer to mainland China than they are. And so they have preferred largely to keep their heads down and maybe just hope that eventually China doesn't turn their way. I think that's a foolish hope. I don't see any indication that China is going to give up on its ambitions to control its entire dash line claim all the way down to those countries' coastlines. But right now, it's just not as acute a problem for them as it is for the Philippines and for Vietnam.
If it isn't the Code of Conduct, which the government is pushing by 2026, and a UN General Assembly would be far-fetched, what would be a better direction for the government to take here? How about improvements to the current DOC? What would be your suggestion then for this administration in light of the escalations over at Sandy Cay, over at Bajo de Masinloc, and the regularity of that harassment? They are going or inching closer and closer to Philippine shores.
As I've said, and of course you just had Rafaela David on, and what they are doing through Atinito and efforts like that, and also just through the Philippines Transparency Initiatives, is alerting the international community. And the Philippines has been gaining a lot of support internationally for its position. So by continuing to strengthen its legal positions, the Philippines is setting up for a long-term fight, right? So when I think of what Atinito is doing, I think of it in terms of nonviolent direct action. This is the kinds of campaigns carried out by Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King against oppressor states, whether it be the Jim Crow South in the United States or the British Empire with India. And those campaigns took a very long time, but they were ultimately successful, and they were ultimately successful because the larger community around them were convinced that they were in the right and the oppressors were in the wrong. And but it doesn't happen instantly. It can be very unsatisfying in the short term. The Filipinos are experiencing water cannons on the water. Well, in Mississippi, they experienced water cannons on land, right? They got water cannon by the police forces in those states. And that happens on one of these long campaigns to be able to push out an imperialist power. And so I think that's what the Philippines is looking ahead to, is rather than trying to find the silver bullet that solves this, whether it be a code of conduct or some kind of UN General Assembly resolution that China will ignore, it will, ultimately it's going to be China getting tired of this, right? So China making a decision in the future, maybe post Xi Jinping or whatever, and saying this just isn't worth it.
And maybe wait for political and economic headwinds that could help our situation. As you mentioned, maybe the nonviolent protests will make its mark out on our seas. And so if they are regularizing their Coast Guard ships and Navy ships, we should regularize our civilian missions.
And build capacity, which is also what you're doing. You're bringing in additional Coast Guard ships, more Navy ships, larger Coast Guard ships. All of those things are important to do, because in the future, what you want is for Beijing to look and say, we've got enough problems in other places. Why are we making problems over this?
All right. Thank you so much for putting that into context for us. We have SeaLight Director and retired U.S. Air Force Colonel Ray Powell talking to us about the latest in the West Philippine Sea.